Something doesn't add up. Scientists ran the DNA, they compared the numbers, they checked the records twice, and then they went quiet. Because what they found inside the genes of millions of modern Americans wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't a small anomaly, it wasn't a rounding error. It was a pattern, ancient, stubborn, and almost impossibly preserved, buried inside the bloodlines of people who have lived in the American mountains for over 300 years. Nobody in the mainstream is talking about this, and the longer you ignore it, the stranger it gets. There is a population living inside the United States right now that genetically doesn't fully belong to the modern American story. Not because they arrived recently, not because they kept themselves separate by choice, but because something in their DNA, something ancient, something encoded thousands of years before America even existed, refused to disappear, refused to dilute, refused to blend into the genetic melting pot the way every textbook said it would. And when scientists finally sat down and compared that DNA against modern American averages, the results produced a silence in the room that nobody expected. This is the story of the Scots-Irish, and it is not the story you think you know. Most people, when they hear the term Scots-Irish, picture a vague historical group. Ulster settlers, frontier people, Appalachian mountain folk, maybe banjo music in old cabins, maybe a distant ancestor in a family tree nobody bothered to dig into. But that image, comfortable, folksy, romanticized, is covering something far more complex, far more genetically remarkable. Because what modern DNA science has uncovered about this specific group of Americans isn't just interesting. It is, by any scientific standard, deeply unusual. Let's begin at the beginning. Not in America, not even in Ireland, but in the ancient steppes of what is now Ukraine and Russia, roughly 4,500 years ago, because that is where the genetic story of the Scots-Irish actually starts. A massive migration of Indo-European people swept westward across the continent during the Bronze Age, carrying with them a specific Y chromosome marker called RM269. They didn't just pass through, they replaced. According to genetic analysis published by Irish Origines, this migration corresponded to a 90% population replacement across Ireland and Scotland. 90%. The people who had lived there before, the Neolithic farmers, the hunter-gatherers, the ancient builders of stone monuments, were genetically erased, and the new arrivals took over. The marker they carried and its downstream mutations, including RDF13 and RM222, became the dominant genetic signature of the Gaelic world. It is a signature that has persisted remarkably intact for 4.5 millennia. Think about what that means. While empires rose and fell, while languages evolved, while religions replaced one another, while borders shifted across the map of Europe, this genetic signature sat quietly in the Y chromosomes of Irish and Scottish men and refused to go anywhere. But here's where it gets interesting. That same ancient marker, carried out of the Eurasian steppes, deposited in Ireland and Scotland over thousands of years, passed from father to son across 150 generations, traveled across the Atlantic Ocean in the 1700s, not in the blood of a few isolated adventurers, in the blood of an estimated 200,000 to 400,000 people who made the journey from Ulster, the northern province of Ireland, to the American colonies over the course of roughly a century. These were the Ulster Scots, the Scots-Irish, and they didn't scatter evenly across the New World. They concentrated. They pushed south and west from Pennsylvania, following the Great Wagon Road through the Shenandoah Valley, down into the Carolinas and into the mountains of what would eventually become Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, and Georgia. And then the mountains closed around them. This is the detail that changes everything. The Appalachian mountain range, stretching nearly 1,500 miles from Alabama to Maine, is not merely a geographic feature. It is, genetically speaking, a preservation chamber. The ridges and hollows that the Scots-Irish settled in the 1700s were some of the most isolated terrain in North America. Roads didn't reach many of these communities for generations. Intermarriage outside the immediate region was rare. The same families, the Campbells, the Hendersons, the McCoys, the Fitzgeralds, the Donnellys, married into each other decade after decade, century after century. And what that geographic isolation did to their genetics is something that modern scientists did not fully appreciate until very recently. According to research backed by population geneticists and confirmed through large-scale DNA testing databases, communities in eastern Kentucky and northeastern Tennessee carry genetic profiles that are strikingly similar to populations in Scotland and Ireland today, not as a percentage resemblance, but as a structural match. The haplogroup frequencies, the specific Y chromosome markers, the mitochondrial DNA patterns passed through maternal lines, all of it clusters in a way that shouldn't be possible for a group that has been living on a different continent for 300 years. Normally, 3 centuries of population mixing produces significant genetic dilution. Normally, a group that moves to a new country and settles there starts to look genetically like its neighbors within a few generations. That is the expected pattern. That is what every population genetics model predicts. The Scots-Irish of the Appalachian core didn't follow that pattern. And when scientists looked at why, the answer was uncomfortable. The mountains did what borders couldn't. They enforced genetic continuity more effectively than any law, any cultural rule, any religious prohibition. In some hollows and valleys, communities remained so isolated that their gene pools barely changed from the 1750s to the 1950s. 200 years on American soil, surrounded by one of the most genetically diverse nations in human history. And yet, their DNA stayed frozen, locked in place like an insect in amber, carrying a signal that traces back not to colonial America, but to the Bronze Age British Isles. What most people are not seeing is that this is not merely a genealogy curiosity. This is a documented genetic phenomenon with real implications for how we understand human population dynamics, cultural preservation, and the long-term effects of geographic isolation on a group's biological identity. But it doesn't stop there. Because when researchers started digging deeper, they found something else, something that the official historical record hadn't prepared them for. The Scots-Irish weren't just genetically preserved. They were genetically distinct in ways that even the original Scottish and Irish populations no longer fully exhibit. Let that settle for a moment. The descendants, the people living in Appalachian America, in some specific genetic measurements, carry markers in higher concentrations than the modern populations of Scotland and Ireland themselves. How is that possible? It is possible because of what geneticists call a founder effect, combined with genetic drift in isolation. When a specific group breaks off from a larger population and remains isolated, rare variants within that founding group can actually increase in frequency over generations, while in the original, broader population, those same variants become diluted through continued mixing with outsiders. The Scots-Irish of the Appalachian interior experienced exactly this. Certain Y chromosome subclades, branches of the ancient RDF13 lineage, appear in concentrated clusters in specific Appalachian counties at rates that exceed what you currently find in the counties of Ulster they originated from. And this is where everything changes. Because this isn't just about genetics anymore, it is about identity. It is about what happens to a people when they carry the past inside them. Not metaphorically, not culturally, but literally in the biological code of every cell in their body. The Scots-Irish of Appalachia developed a culture that, by the 20th century, had become recognized as one of the most internally cohesive regional cultures in the entire United States. Not because of political organization, not because of media representation, but because the same isolation that preserved their genes also preserved their language, their music, their oral traditions, their value systems, and their social structures. What linguists call a preserved dialect, the archaic speech patterns still found in some Appalachian hollows, using grammatical forms and vocabulary that disappeared from mainstream English centuries ago, is the cultural equivalent of those frozen genetic markers. Both the language and the DNA are saying the same thing. Something here was protected by the mountains. Something survived that should have dissolved. The oral traditions, the ballads, the fiddle music that European ethnomusicologists who visited Appalachia in the early 20th century immediately recognized as structurally identical to Scottish and Irish folk music from centuries before. The Presbyterian religious culture, the fierce independence, the suspicion of central authority, the clan-based loyalty structures where family came above everything else, all of these things, which scholars once attributed to the hardships of frontier life, are now being re-examined through a genetic and cultural lens that reveals something far older at work. These weren't adaptations to America. These were transplants from the British Isles that survived, intact, in the American mountains, because the mountains allowed them to. But here's the part that makes scientists genuinely uncomfortable. The Scots-Irish didn't only preserve ancient traits. According to more recent population studies, including data examined through the Ancestry DNA reference panels updated in 2025, which now compare individual DNA against over 146 distinct global population clusters using approximately 300,000 genetic markers. The Appalachian Scots-Irish cluster sits in a position that doesn't map cleanly onto any modern European population. It overlaps with Scotland, it overlaps with Ulster, but it doesn't collapse into either one. It occupies a unique genetic space. A space that was created 3 centuries ago when a specific subset of Scottish and Irish people, carrying a specific slice of the total genetic diversity of those populations, moved into an isolated mountain environment and stayed there. What that means, in plain language, is this. The Scots-Irish of the Appalachian interior are, genetically speaking, a population that no longer fully exists in Europe. They are a preserved snapshot of a specific moment in Scots-Irish genetic history. The original populations moved on. They kept mixing, they absorbed Viking genetic inputs, Norman inputs, English inputs, and in Ulster, plantation-era Scottish inputs that continued to reshape the population. But the Appalachian descendants, they didn't absorb any of that. They stayed still. And in staying still, they became something that is, paradoxically, older than the population they came from. Read that again. The Scots-Irish Americans, in certain genetic respects, are more closely related to the ancient populations of Scotland and Ireland than the people currently living in Scotland and Ireland are. The modern inhabitants of Ulster have been mixing and changing for 3 additional centuries that the Appalachian descendants missed entirely, and that has produced a genetic divergence that nobody was expecting when scientists first started asking the question. The real story, according to informed sources in population genetics, is that this finding upends a central assumption of American immigration history. The assumption was that immigration to America meant genetic assimilation, that over generations, every group would dilute into the broader American genetic pool. For most groups, in most circumstances, this is true. The Scots-Irish of the Appalachian core broke that rule, not intentionally, not through any organized effort at preservation, simply through geography and circumstance. The mountains were the border that no other force could enforce. Now, consider the numbers. The United States Census Bureau reports over 5 million Americans who identify as having Scots-Irish or Scotch-Irish ancestry. Independent demographic estimates, accounting for the many Americans who carry this ancestry but don't specifically label it, push the true figure considerably higher, potentially into the tens of millions, particularly when you include the broader Appalachian diaspora that spread out of the mountains during the 20th century's industrial migrations into cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, and Pittsburgh. And here's the thing. Genetic community analysis on major DNA testing platforms consistently identifies this group. They cluster. They find each other in matching databases. They share specific genetic signatures that flag them as a coherent community, even when they have no prior knowledge of their connection. According to informed sources in genetic genealogy, the Scots-Irish community database on platforms like Family Tree DNA is one of the most tightly clustered ethnic communities in the entire American dataset. People from different states, different economic backgrounds, different surnames, different family stories, connecting through DNA to a shared genetic signature that traces back to Ulster, Scotland in the 1600s, and beyond that to the Bronze Age Atlantic coast. The thread is unbroken. It has survived 300 years on a different continent and is still identifiable. But what makes this particularly striking is what the DNA reveals about the journey itself. The Scots-Irish didn't come directly from Scotland to America. Their path was far more complicated, and that complexity is written in their genes. The original Scots, who were sent, or who chose to go, to Ulster during the plantation era beginning in the early 1600s, were predominantly from the Scottish lowlands. They were not Highland Gaels, they were border Scots, carrying their own specific mixture of ancient Celtic and Anglo-Norman genetic heritage. They arrived in Ulster and spent roughly 5 generations, 100 years, living alongside, occasionally mixing with, but largely remaining separate from the existing Irish Catholic population. And then they moved again. The combination of economic hardship, religious conflict, and a series of devastating droughts in the early 1700s pushed them across the Atlantic. And they arrived in the American colonies carrying a genetic profile that was already a layered document. Ancient Celtic substratum, Scottish lowland overlay, minimal but real Ulster-Irish admixture. All encoded, all preserved, and all about to be sealed inside the Appalachian Mountains for another 3 centuries. What most people are not seeing is that this means the Scots-Irish Americans carry within them a genetic record of multiple migrations. Each layer of that record tells a story. The deepest layer, the RDF13 lineage, goes back to the Bronze Age and the original Indo-European migration into Atlantic Europe. The next layer tells the story of the formation of the Scottish lowland population. The next layer tells the story of the Ulster plantation. And the final layer tells the story of what happened when all of that was deposited into the American mountains and left undisturbed. It is not one story. It is 4,000 years of stories compressed into a single DNA sample. And the implications of this extend beyond genealogy into something far more significant. Because if one group of Americans can preserve their genetic identity so completely over 3 centuries of supposed integration into a melting pot, what does that tell us about the broader question of how cultures, identities, and biological continuities actually work over time? The standard model of immigration and assimilation assumes a one-way flow. You come, you mix, you blend, you become American, and genetically eventually you become indistinguishable from the broader population around you. The Scots-Irish case suggests that this model is incomplete at best, that geography can override the social forces of assimilation, that when a population is physically isolated, even on the same continent as the melting pot doesn't reach them. And 300 years later, Scientists look at their DNA and find a coherent, identifiable, surprisingly pure genetic signature staring back at them. That is not what the textbooks predicted. That is not what the social science models accounted for. And that is why, when the comparison was done, when scientists placed the Scots-Irish American genetic profile next to the modern American average, the results didn't make sense. Because what you see in the average American genome is exactly what you expect from 300 years of the most genetically diverse immigration experiment in human history. You see mixing, you see dilution, you see multiple ancestral streams blending together into something new. And when you compare that average against the Scots-Irish Appalachian cluster, you are not comparing two versions of the same process. You are comparing two fundamentally different outcomes. One group integrated, the other didn't. And the one that didn't is now sitting on American soil, carrying a genetic profile that belongs, more accurately, to a specific place and time in the British Isles that no longer exists in the same form anywhere on Earth. This is not chaos. This is preservation. Accidental, geographic, 300-year-long preservation, but preservation nonetheless. The cultural echoes of this genetic continuity are everywhere, once you know how to look. The Appalachian dialect that retained grammatical structures from 17th century Scots and Ulster English, while the rest of America's English evolved and standardized. The music, the modal scales, the drone-based harmonies, the ballad structures, that ethnomusicologists from Scotland and Ireland recognized immediately when they heard it in the mountains of North Carolina and Kentucky in the 1910s and 1920s, because they were hearing something they hadn't heard in their own countries for a century or more. The intense kinship loyalty, the deep Presbyterian religiosity that shaped entire regional cultures, the distrust of outside authority that goes back not to the American frontier, but to generations of experience with English colonial rule, both in Scotland and in Ulster, before the Scots-Irish ever set foot in America. These cultural traits didn't emerge from the mountains. They were brought to the mountains, and the mountains kept them, the same way the mountains kept the genes, because culture and biology, in this case, were reinforcing each other. The genetic homogeneity of isolated communities supported cultural homogeneity. The cultural identity reinforced the tendency to marry within the community, which reinforced the genetic homogeneity. It was a self-sustaining loop, and it ran for 300 years without anyone fully understanding what was happening. According to the population genetics work published through Cambridge University Press examining Scottish diaspora genetics, the American Scots-Irish represent one of the most significant natural experiments in diaspora genetics that the modern world possesses. Significant not because they are unique in having migrated, tens of millions of people migrated to America, but because they are nearly unique in the degree to which they maintain genetic coherence over such an extended period in such a diverse host nation. Most diaspora populations show measurable integration within 3 to 5 generations. The Appalachian Scots-Irish show integration rates that, in the most isolated communities, barely match what you would expect from 1 or 2 generations of mixing. The mountains bought them 2 additional centuries of genetic continuity that the open plains and coastal cities never could have. And here is what makes this truly unsettling for the standard model of American identity. The Scots-Irish story is not the story of a group that chose to remain separate. They didn't build walls. They didn't establish legal or religious prohibitions against intermarriage with other groups. And they simply lived where the roads didn't go. They farmed where the valleys allowed. They built their communities in the places that everyone else passed through without stopping. And in doing so, they created something that no policy, no ideology, no cultural movement could have manufactured deliberately, a living genetic archive of a people who no longer fully exist in their homeland. The question that nobody in the mainstream is answering is this: what does it mean when a diaspora population becomes more genetically representative of an ancient homeland than the homeland itself? What does it mean for our understanding of identity, of ancestry, of the relationship between geography and biology, when 300 years and 3,000 miles of ocean are less powerful than one mountain range? And there is a further question, one that the data is pushing toward, but that science has not yet fully confronted. The Scots-Irish are not the only isolated American population. There are communities across Appalachia, across the rural South, across the American interior, whose genetic profiles have not followed the standard assimilation model. What other genetic stories are sitting undiscovered in the mountain hollows and isolated plains communities of this country? What other ancient signals are waiting in DNA databases, hiding inside the samples of people who think of themselves simply as American, who have no idea that their genes are carrying a message from a time and place that mainstream history has already moved past? The science is advancing faster than the interpretation. The databases are growing, the reference panels are expanding, and with every update, like the Ancestry DNA 2025 panel that added 68 new European ancestral regions and began identifying population structure at a finer resolution than ever before. More of these hidden signals are coming into focus. Communities that were invisible in the data 5 years ago are now appearing as distinct, coherent clusters with specific geographic origins and specific genetic histories that don't match the assimilation model. What the Scots-Irish case has done is crack open the assumption. It has shown with data that the American melting pot is not as total as we believed, that geography can override social integration, that genetics can preserve what history tries to erase, that a group of people can arrive in a new world, disappear into its mountains, and emerge 3 centuries later carrying inside them a genetic record of a place and time that the rest of the world has moved on from. And that should make you ask, if the Scots-Irish preserved this much, what else is preserved? What other populations and what other isolated pockets of this vast country are sitting on a genetic inheritance that doesn't match the story we've been told about who Americans are and where they came from? What signals are still waiting to be found? What ancient markers are still sitting in American DNA, quiet and patient, waiting for a scientist to look closely enough to see them? The results don't make sense until they do, and then they change everything.